Hello everybody, and welcome back to a brand new video. In today's video, we'll be doing my updated prediction for the 2022 gubernatorial elections. I'm going to show you who's going to win each and every one of these races and why. Before we get started with that though, let's talk about the generic ballot, which is basically the best way to predict the general outcome. So, in case you don't know, generic ballot and national environment are basically the same thing. It's basically just the amount that in a midterm or in a presidential election, but it's used more in midterms because there's no presidential race to talk about. It's basically just the amount that a party wins by nationwide. So the best way to calculate this is House vote, because again, there's an election in every House seat, whereas Senate and governor, some seats obviously, some races aren't up. So the generic ballot is basically just the House vote. Now, in a presidential election, there are basically two nationwide metrics you can use. You can use the popular vote of the presidency. So in 2020, Biden won by 4.4%. So that would have been a D plus 4.4 environment. And then the House vote something like, I think, D plus 3.3, because the Democrats won the House vote by about 3.3%. So since we don't have a presidential election, we're just going to be looking at the generic ballot here. And the generic ballot's been getting really good for the Democrats. So right now they have a 1.5% lead, which is, it's really been growing consistently since, really it started right here around the beginning of July, which was just a few weeks after the Dobbs decision came in. Because again, it was pretty stable. It was a 2.5 to 3 point lead consistently for the Republicans dating back to the end of January as we got more polling. And then, the Democrats overtook, they tied the Republicans on the day of August 3rd, and then they took the lead on August, I think it was the 4th or 5th. Yeah, they took a very near lead on the 4th, took the official lead on the 5th. And so since then, they haven't relinquished it. They've been gaining. And since Labor Day, we talked about a post-Labor Day bounce for the GOP. Democrats have increased their lead by 0.5%, which may not seem like a lot, but nationwide, a 0.5% increase for support in a party could decide a lot of House seats and a few Senate or governor seats as well. So that is, I guess, the best way to see where we're at. Now, I think that this is like a decently good indicator of where we are. I think the national polls might overestimate Democrats by a little bit, but that's not actually a safe assumption to make, because in the polls, since the 2020 election, the polls either underestimated Democrats or they have been pretty good. So in the Georgia runoffs, I think that they had Warnock doing a little worse than he ended up doing, and they had Ossoff doing a little better than he ended up doing. But either way, they were pretty good. I think the average was like Warnock +1 and Ossoff +1, so they were both around where they would be. Again, like some polls like Trafalgar had like Loeffler winning and whatnot, but those are just bad Republican leaning polls. The 20, I think we had one special election poll for the New Mexico special election last year that underestimated Democrats. The California recall polls underestimated Democrats by a lot. The New Jersey polls, we only got a few New Jersey polls, which is why the polls were pretty bad. But that was like the one exception to the rule where the polls underestimated Republicans, but that's mostly a result of no one really polling New Jersey because everyone thought it was not going to matter. And that's also kind of a result of Phil Murphy having running a really bad campaign and everyone basically forgetting there was an election, which is why it was such a close call for the Democrats. Now, the Virginia polls were actually really good. On election day, I think Youngkin led the 538 average by 2%, and he ended up winning by 2%. In the, I think we only got a few polls in the Texas 34 election, the special election the Republicans picked up in the Rio Grande Valley. That, that seat, I think, the polls overestimated Republicans by, I think, 2% in the one poll we got. The polls underestimated Democrats by a lot in the Minnesota 1 election, although, again, that's only one poll. And then in the New York 19 election, we had 4 polls, all of which had Mark Molinaro beating Pat Ryan. And on election day, a DFP poll, which is supposedly a Democratic poll, they've been not really Democratic leaning as of late, but the DFP poll showed Mark Molinaro winning by 8%. He ended up losing by 2%. So that's a 10% gap in just that one poll on election day. I think the average was Molinaro up by 6%. So Pat Ryan, clearly was underestimated by the polls. And then lastly, in the Alaska election, what we saw was that the polls were actually pretty good, and that most of them either showed a dead heat or a very narrow Portola lead if you got Palin in second place, which ended up happening. And obviously, she won by about 3%. I think she would have been up in an average by 1% if you were to calculate it, but I didn't do that because they didn't have it on 538. So that's kind of where we are. I think the polls nationally will be maybe a little bullish on Democrats. I think a D plus 1.5 environment might be a bit much. It's probably be closer to D plus 0.5. My current prediction for the national environment's again, a very narrow Democratic leaning environment. It's maybe a D plus 0.4, D plus 0.6, literally in the decimals for the Democrats. But either way, if they keep expanding their lead, if it's a D plus 3 on election day, it'll be very good for them. And like even any Democratic leading environment in the polls would be very good for the Democrats. So my point here is that the fact the Democrats are like this close to the election, they still are maintaining and growing their lead is really good for them. I think it's really good for their prospects all across the board, but a lot in governor's races because again, if we were in a super Republican environment, Democrats will be losing a lot more of these races than they're going to end up losing. So let's get into it here with our safe Democratic states, which obviously California, Gavin Newsom will win re-election. Hawaii, that's an open seat, but Josh Green, the lieutenant governor for the Democrats, is going to win that seat. Illinois, J.B. Pritzker's probably going to win by around 15 against Darren Bailey. Maryland, this is a Democratic pickup again. Larry Hogan, the incumbent Republican, is term limited, so he can't run again. Same with Massachusetts, Charlie Baker, the popular GOP incumbent, term limited, he can't run again. Yeah, that's and then New York also. Like the polls in New York have been kind of close. Like if you look at these governors polls, there've been like a few polls, if I can find, there've been like a few polls that have like had like randomly close. It's mostly because Trafalgar and Coefficient, which are both Republican polls, have had it weirdly close. But that's, Trafalgar, as we know, has like literally thinks that Vermont will be a 7-point race and that Washington is a toss-up. So don't put too much stock into it. Hochul's probably now run her polls by a fairly good amount. Say Republican states, it's going to be Idaho, Wyoming, South Dakota. Although we did get one internal poll that showed Nome only up by 3, but that's kind of a goofy poll. I wouldn't really put too much stock into it. Nebraska, Oklahoma has been interesting, actually. I will say this because the Democrats are running they're running the former, I think, state superintendent who was a Republican, but she's now running as a Democrat. She's been doing kind of well in the polls. Again, Sooner poll, which is the local Oklahoma poll, isn't too good, but they do a decent job. They only had stayed up by 1%. This is a super Republican state, so it's worth like literally no polls have stayed actually doing particularly well, and he's actually not popular. Like in 2018, he only won by 12% in a state that Trump won by like 35. So he's probably going to like run behind Trump by a good amount, but it won't be anything close to like a 15-point margin victory. But I just thought I'd point that out. Arkansas, Tennessee, Alabama, nothing special there. And and then Vermont, obviously that might be weird to see on a map because usually Vermont's super blue, but it's just because there's a super popular GOP incumbent, Phil Scott, who's going to win re-election by like 30%. He's basically a moderate, like he's super liberal Republican. He'll win re-election easily. Same with Chris Sununu, who's a moderate Republican, very popular in New Hampshire. He'll win by a little less than he won by in 2020, but he's still win by like 20, 25 points. So yeah, now these are the states that are kind of in play. Oh, I forgot. Iowa and Ohio should be safe. They're kind of like Illinois in that they could fall like below 15%, but it's not really worth talking about. So I'm just gonna have them as safe. So yeah, that's this is kind of the remaining states are competitive to some degree. Obviously, some are closer than others, but yeah. So let's get into it with our likely Democratic states. The first of which is Colorado. Jared Polis is a pretty popular incumbent. I don't think the Republicans they're running a very generic nominee who doesn't really have any appeal. And to win Colorado as a Republican, you have to have a lot of moderate appeal. And Heidi Gaynell doesn't have that. And Polis has good approval ratings. He'll probably win by 10-12%. Minnesota's another one. Originally, there was some concern for the Democrats because Tim Walz, I think there was a Wheat Party candidate on the ballot, and Tim Walz was supposedly the path for a GOP victory would be splitting the vote between Walz and the Wheat Party candidate. But the polls have been abysmal for Scott Jensen, and Jensen has run he has no money. He's run no ads. The GOP do not really care about his race at all, and they're not funding him. Whereas Tim Walz has a ton of money in the bank, and he's just spending and attacking Jensen, and he's a popular incumbent. It's really hard to beat out a popular incumbent in a state that leans towards that party. And again, when you look at these other polls, Survey USA has Walz up by 18, Graves has him up by 17. Although this is weird because the independent candidate did an internal poll. It's kind of funny because it showed him at 2% of the vote, but they have they had 6% of the vote. My bad. But they had Walz up by 17, which is kind of funny. Scott Jensen, who's the Republican, released an internal showing him down by 4, which is kind of embarrassing because that's the best he could get. Then all these other polls had Walz up by a bunch over his other challengers. He's going to be fine. I think he'll win re-election by 5, 6, 7%, similar to what Biden did in Minnesota. Same with Michigan. Originally, I was thought this was going to be a really close race, but Tudor Dix is just running an awful campaign. She's down by 11% right now, and she keeps making statements that are really, really harmful for her. She's said, for example, that she doesn't support exceptions for abortion in any cases. I'm not going to say the words because I don't want to get demonetized and whatnot. But I think you know what I'm talking about. No exceptions for blank. She has like I on paper she could actually be a decent candidate because like she was I think a TV personality and like she has some level of appeal to like moderate conservatives, but her campaign's just been god awful. It's arguably been worse than Doug Mastriano's, which is hard to do. And I think that um barring like a complete turnaround in Whitmer's, like Whitmer's really popular right now. Unless she becomes super unpopular between now and election day, I don't see her losing. Especially when you consider that Whitmer's up by 13 in Glengarriff, she's up 11 in Epic MRA. Blueprint, I don't really care about, but they have her up by 12. Fabrizio and Lee have her up by 5. Then these other polls from the Detroit News had her up by like double digits over all these GOP candidates. They had her leading Dixon by 10. And then we had some Target Insight polls that had her up by like insane margins. That won't happen. But it's kind of interesting that Dixon's closest poll is Trafalgar, and she's still down 4. And Trafalgar again is the poll that thinks Washington, Vermont, and New York are all competitive. So that's not really particularly good for Tudor Dixon, and I expect her to lose by 5.5-6% when it's all said and done. Next up is Connecticut. Connecticut is generally pretty close to the governor's level, but this time I think it'll be not really contested. Like it'll be likely not because I think that Bob Stefanowski has any real chance of winning, but it's mostly because again there's some there's some level of Biden voters who are more conservative down ballot and will probably vote for Bob Stefanowski. Again, he ran a good campaign in 2018. He only lost by 3% in a blue wave, which is really impressive showing for him. But this time around, he's not been really running a particularly good campaign. I think that Lamont is a lot more popular now than he was 4 years ago, and ultimately, the abortion ruling I think really killed any chance of Stefanowski winning. I think I had it as like lean Democrat prior, but it's likely, and I don't really think Stefanowski has a chance anymore. Rhode Island's interesting because there was a contested Democratic primary between Dan McKee and someone else, and like McKee only won by 2%, and he's not really that popular. He wasn't even elected; he's just lieutenant governor who replaced Gina Raimondo after she served in the Biden administration. We only have 2 polls, and he's leading, by 28 and 23. He'll probably be fine. Like, I don't think he'll win by the 20s, but I think he'll win by 13 or 14%. Although it's worth noting that he's not super popular, and having Alan Fung on the ballot in the second district will probably boost GOP support. So I think that this race could be like kind of close, but I don't really think the GOP have any real chance of winning. So yeah, that's I think our likely Democratic states. There likely Republican states. They have a few. The first is Alaska, where it's a really convoluted race. It's kind of hard to talk about. But when you look at the polls right here, they're all over the place. So there's really 3 candidates. There's incumbent Republican Mike Dunleavy. There is independent former Governor Bill Walker, who won in 2018. He's kind of like a moderate Democrat, but he runs as an independent. And then Les Garrett, who's just the Democratic nominee. I think that we're like really whoever comes in second place uh will obviously probably like lose. Like unlike it's kind of similar to the House election where we had Poltola getting like 40% of the vote in the first round and getting barely enough exhausted ballots and baggage votes to rank her second to beat Palin. And I think we're going to see a similar thing. Like Dunleavy might not crack 50% on election day, but Guerra and Walker won't have like enough support, like even like if you combine it to I think unseat him. So I don't really know who come in second or third. It's kind of hard to like predict who's gonna like ranked choice voting race, who's gonna come in second, who's gonna come in third. But I will say that I think there's like a small chance of Dunleavy losing, but ultimately he'll still probably win re-election by 9-10%. Next up is the state of Kansas. Kansas, I've been people have been telling me that I'm like a little too bullish on Laura Kelly losing. And I kind of get that. I think originally I had her losing by like 10. I think that was maybe a little unfair to her. But I mean, like when you take a look at the polls, like she's up by 12 in this echelon poll, but I don't really care about that. When you look at like the other polls, they're like the only poll she's actually leading in is this Emily's List poll, has her up by 3%. And like it's just to me, I don't really like I'm not like I don't want to dismiss it, but it's also a Democratic poll, and yeah, you can say the same thing about these polls that Chris Kobach, he's a Republican candidate for I think like maybe Attorney General, has Schmidt up by 4, and the John Brown Freedom Fund is a Republican poll. They have Schmidt up by 3. So like these are all pretty bad polls, but ultimately, and like yes, by the way, I do want more Kansas polls because like none of the polls really been good except for Remington, and they're still pretty Republican leaning. But what I will say about Kansas is that it does tend to like vote Democratic down ballot. Like in the 2014 governor's race, despite it being a red wave, uh, but Sam Brownback, the Republican governor, only won re-election by like 3%. And in 2018, obviously Laura Kelly, the Democrat, won by 5%. So like there will be some level of split ticketing here, but or ticket splitting. I don't split ticketing. sorry, I meant ticket splitting, and that they'll vote Republican for Senate but Democrat for governor. But ultimately, though, like Kelly's running a really good campaign. I think she's doing the best she can, but I think the partisanship of her state is going to catch up to her, and she'll lose by 5 to 6%. Texas, I think Texas is like underrated. People like everyone says Beto's going to lose by like 12. I think he'll lose by like 8 or 9%. I think it'll be single digits. That's what I will say. Um, we don't have like a ton of polls. Abbott's up by 7.5, which I think is actually pretty accurate right now. Because historically, Texas polls have underestimated Democrats. Beto was underestimated by I think 2% in 2018. Hillary was underestimated by I think 1% in 2016. Yes, in 2020 the polls overshot Biden by like I think 4%, but like the polls like were really bad everywhere in 2020, and I think they're going to kind of revert to like only being bad in like the Rust Belt. Which by the way, I talked about this in my podcast that came out on Sunday or yesterday. So please go listen to that if you haven't already. It's on my YouTube channel. It's literally the second video before this. So, but like my point here is that I think the polls are actually a pretty good indicator of where we are. I think Abbott will win by like 7.5, maybe 8, maybe a little more, but it's still I think these polls make a lot of sense. Again, Echelon, which has been really weird as of late, has only has Abbott up by 3. I think he'll win by a lot more. I think UGov or UT is going to be better at this. But either way, I do think Beto will do better than people think in the Dallas suburbs. But at the end of the day, I still think he loses by more than Biden did. Like, if he can match Biden's performance, that'll be really impressive considering the circumstances. Next up is Florida. Obviously, Ron DeSantis, pretty decently popular governor in Florida. Right now, he's leading in the polls by 6.1%. So yeah, that's kind of what you'd expect. The polls tend to underestimate Republicans in Florida. They underestimated Trump by 5%. In 2020, they underestimated him by like I think 2% in 2016. I think we'll see a similar thing. DeSantis will probably be up by like 5 or 6% on election day, but he'll probably win by close to 8%, which I don't really have any strong feelings. I think he'll win pretty easily. Same with South Carolina. Joe Cunningham's a good candidate, and Henry McMaster isn't like the most popular incumbent. But at the end of the day, black turnout has been historically pretty bad in South Carolina during midterm elections, and in the limited polling we have, it's mostly just Democratic internals. And it's interesting that Trafalgar only has McMaster's up by 8. I think he'll win by probably close to like 13 or 14, to be honest. But yeah, I mean, I don't really know. The Cunningham internal has him down by 7, which is like probably like the best result they could have gotten. So like if you treat 7% as the best case scenario for Cunningham, he'll probably lose by close to like 12 or 13. So that's what I'm expecting for right now. So yeah, that's it for likely our states. Again, they don't it doesn't really mean much because it's like no voting. But if you would all Republicans have to do from here is win one more governor's race, and they'd have a majority in the RGA, which again isn't like a Senate or House majority because they don't vote on anything, but it's just kind of an important benchmark. So yeah, next up is Oregon. Oregon, I was originally kind of concerned that it would kind of surprise me and elect a Republican, but Oregon's gonna be really weird because we have three candidates who actually have a chance of winning. We have Tina Kodak, the Democrat. Christine Drawson, who I think is like a minority leader of the Oregon State House for the Republicans, and then Betsy Johnson, who's the former Democratic state senator who left the party and is running as independent. Johnson will probably take away some votes from Kotek, but she's you would think that she'd be a spoiler for Kotek and that she'd give the race to the Republicans, but she's been running like a very right wing campaign, and so I think that we could see a scenario in which, on paper, she'd take away more votes from the Democrats, but her campaign has been very right wing or not very right wing, but much more guns and whatnot than abortion and healthcare. She's campaigning on more Republican issues, so she could potentially her draws on in the rural areas. But I think it'll kind of cancel out, and I think Kodak will win by 4 or 5%. Next up is New Mexico. Originally, I actually thought the race would narrowly vote Republican, but since the Dobbs decision, have kind of reversed on that. When you look at the polls, they've shown Lujan Grisham up by 6%, and even the polls that have been more Republican leaning have not been really good for Lujan Grisham, or have not really been good for Ron Shetty. Again, he's down in this other GOP poll back in January, but also more recently, this KOB poll, which has actually overestimated Republicans in the past, has him down by 12. He's down by 5 in Emerson, which has not really been good this year, but it's worth noting. Down 7 in Albuquerque Journal, down 4 in this Democratic leaning poll, which is interesting. That's close to all these other polls, but whatever. Down 3 in PPP, and then Survey USA, he's down by a bunch in these different, or down by 4 in all these different polls. So, yeah, the only poll he's actually leading is his own internal, but he's only up by 1, and I don't know. He's also also the crossups of the polls been really good for Lujan Grisham, and Ron Chetty hasn't really attacked her scandal as much as of late, so I don't really know. Like, his 2020 Senate campaign was really good, but his campaign for governor has been kind of like lackluster so far. So I've lost a lot of my original confidence in him. Next up is Pennsylvania. Again, Pennsylvania, like, I don't really. There are like a lot of people who really think Doug Mastriano is going to win. I don't really get that because, again, when you look at the polls, Shapiro's up by 10.4%. He hasn't, like, Mastriano hasn't really made it close. He was up by 8 starting in July. He's down. It was 8, 9, 7, 10. Like, Mastriano hasn't even come within 5% of Shapiro since, like, we only had one poll, and, like, that was just one poll. And so, like, the fact that Mastriano literally has no money. He hasn't bought a single TV ad, like, the entire campaign. He probably won't since the primary. He hasn't he hasn't been able to, like, raise any money to try to contest Shapiro on the airwaves. Like, Shapiro's just bombing the airwaves with, like, all of his, attacking Mastriano, like, Shapiro's been able to brand Mastriano the way he wants and not the way Mastriano wants. And that's, I think, what'll be the downfall of Mastriano. Because he's kind of a nobody candidate because people on Twitter might know who Doug Mastriano is because he's, like, retweeting fake polls and, like, saying things that a lot of people disagree with. But at the end of the day, like, the average Pennsylvanian who would, like, be required to vote for Doug Mastriano might not even know who he is because he doesn't have any TV ads, doesn't have any, like, get out the vote type stuff. And Shapiro, he's the Attorney General of Pennsylvania. He outran Biden by 4% in 2020 when he won re-election. Like, he's a really good candidate. He's probably, like, one of the best candidates the Democrats could have gotten this year. And I just don't get the hype around Mastriano. I think he'll lose by 4 or 5% when it's all said and done. And honestly, like, most Republicans will agree with me. Most Republicans don't even think Mastriano is going to win. Like, the only people who think Mastriano is going to win are, like, the people on Twitter who, like, are, like, genuinely think it's it's just most I think people who, like, are more objective will tell you that Mastriano will lose. Main similar thing here. Originally, I thought this race was going to be, like, really close, but since the Dobbs decision, it just hasn't been there for the GOP. Again, like, when you take a look at the polls here, none of them have shown a Paul DePage lead. And again, he's the former governor, so you'd think he'd be a decent candidate, but Mills is also not, like, unpopular enough to lose Maine. So I think she'll win by, like, 3 to 4%. It could be, like, this is a sleeper flip for the GOP, but I don't really think they've been targeting as much as they originally wanted to. So that's why I do think that Mills is going to end up winning re-election here. So lean Republican states, we've got 2 that I see. First is Wisconsin. This will give them the majority in the RGA. Again, Tony Evers is not an awful incumbent, but he's not also popular enough to, like, withstand the red wave. And again, people can say, oh, well, Wisconsin's really hard to beat out an incumbent in Wisconsin because they really like their incumbents. But, like, the thing is, in 2018, Evers only won by a point against Scott Walker, and Walker had, like, really made a lot of people angry in his time as governor, and it was a blue wave. That's not an impressive showing. In addition to that, Tony Evers has, I think, has, like, a -3 net approval rating because, like, a lot of, like, most Republicans really dislike him. And so ultimately he has a good chance of winning. I think he has, like, a 35 to 40% chance of getting reelected, but he has to do, like, a lot. Because, like, the thing is, the reason he won in 2018 was because he did really well with working class voters. He probably won't be able to do that again. And so ultimately, I think that at the end of the day, we're going to see a ton of counties trending red in the working class areas. And we're going to, like, Evers will probably do better than he did in 2018 with suburban voters in Waukesha County and whatnot, but it won't be enough to, make up for that support he's losing. Additionally, Milwaukee turnout will probably not be great for Democrats, in all honesty. So I think Evers will probably lose by, 2.5%, 3%, something like that. Georgia, too. Georgia, like, I'm really close to moving it to likely. I think it'll be about a 5% margin of victory for Brian Kemp. The polls have him up by a little more right now, but historically the polls have underestimated Democrats in Georgia. Again, I know in 2020 they didn't, but, like in 2020 they're actually pretty accurate. Maybe not actually. The polls have narrowed up. So, sorry, what I was saying is that Kemp. So in 2018, Abrams, for example, was down by 3. She only lost by a 1.5. So 2018, the polls underestimated Democrats. 2016, they underestimated Democrats. Even 2012, they underestimated Democrats. And if you take a look at 2020, the polls were, I think, only a point off in the 538 average. They had Biden up by 1. He ended up winning by, like, 0.2. So, they're not bad. But, like, most polls have had Kemp ahead by, like, low, like, mid single digits, that kind of thing. Abrams has only led in 2 polls, and, like, that's not really good for her. And again, she literally released an internal showing her losing, which is never the sign of a good campaign. So, originally she was a strong candidate, but she's really just not been able to appeal to suburban white voters that gave the state to Joe Biden and Ossoff and Warnock. And I think while Warnock could be a narrow favorite to win re-election this year, I have a hard time seeing how Abrams can pull it off unless it goes to a runoff. Like, if it goes to a runoff, it's probably a toss-up. But if not, I don't see her winning on election day. So yeah, now remaining 2 races, I think we're gonna be really close. I guess I'll split them just to be nice. Um, like originally, I did have Katie Hobbs winning, Arizona. I think last time I did this, but her campaign has been really sloppy. And yeah, like Carrie Lake isn't really that good of a candidate, but Katie Hobbs won't debate her. She has like not really done a ton of get out the vote stuff from what I've seen in the majority Hispanic in the more urban areas where Democrats have struggled with turnout in midterms, and also, um, Arizona is like much more Republican down ballots. Like they'll vote Democrat for Senate or president, but like local races like Attorney General or like governor or local office, it's more Republican leaning even still. So I think this is like Arizona is like the closest race as of right now, but like I'm basically counting on there being about a 2.5 to 3 point polling error in Arizona. That is just uh like you know just I think a little too close for me. So like if Hobbs is up by 4 on election day, I think I'll move her to favored. But for now, I'm counting on like narrowing up the polls a little bit because like the latest polls we've gotten have been really like weird. Like Center Street PAC has Hobbs up by 14 and 12, which does not make any sense. And like when you take those polls out, it's basically just a 2 point lead for Hobbs. And so I think as of right now, she'd like lose by like half a point or something really close like that. But I think by election day, I could change it back to the Democrats. Nevada's similar. It's always really close. But the thing is, the Republicans are struggling a little bit in Nevada in the polls. And again, the thing you have to remember is that Nevada is the only state in 2016 that had Trump winning that Clinton ended up winning. And Lombardo hasn't been able to find the lead in many polls. Like Fabrizio has him up by 2 and then down by 3. And Fabrizio's like this is Donald Trump's pollster. Emerson has him tied, and Emerson has been really bad in the Sun Belt as of late. Trafalgar only has him up by 3, and Trafalgar had Trump winning Nevada in 2020. So if you adjust for that, he'd be down. Then in like these other better polls, he's still down, and like even in his own internal, he's down by 2. And again, when you're down your own internal, really not good. So, I'll just keep it as tilt D for now. I would not be stunned if Lombardo wins, but the polls right now are just really bad for him, and he need to narrow that gap a little bit for me to have him favored. So, yeah, this is my current governor's prediction. I think Republicans are going to get a majority again, and they're going to win they're going to beat out, I think, the incumbent Democrats of Laura Kelly and Tony Evers. I think they're going to hold Arizona, hold Georgia, hold Texas, and Alaska and Florida, as well as South Carolina. I think Democrats will do pretty well in most of like the lean D races. I think they're going to be fine in Oregon, fine in New Mexico, fine in Pennsylvania, fine in Maine. They'll hold on to the easier holds like Michigan, Minnesota, Connecticut, Rhode Island, Colorado. I think that the true toss-ups of the night are going to be Nevada and Arizona, which I think could split, which is why I'm going with that as of right now. So yeah, thanks so much for watching this video. I hope you enjoyed. If you did, please leave a like, subscribe to the channel if you haven't already. I'll see you all in the next one. Bye, guys.